Tom Lavecchia here with the latest edition of the Armchair MBA. Very happy to have a friend, a colleague, if I could say it, a return guest. He was on the previous show a few times. Scott Deitche, right?
Yep.
Said it correctly. It only took me 20 times. Who is an author, wrote numerous books. We'll get into in a moment. He wrote Cigar City Mafia, also books about the Jersey mob and so forth. And he's pretty well-rounded in terms of the space, but we're going to kind of hone a little bit today. But before we jump in, Scott Deitche, welcome to the Armchair MBA. How you doing today, buddy?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on again. Look forward to it.
It's my pleasure. So one of the things that I wanted to chat about today is we talk about Santo Trafficante, and I always say, like, in terms of history of Cosa Nostra, two names that really kind of stand out as being like really powerful, but are maybe talked about a little less are, Carlos Morcillo, as well as Santo Trafficante. So give us a little bit about background about him and a little bit about the Tampa mob.
Yeah. So, like you said, they're kind of interesting in the sense that, here was this small Sicilian mafia family in a southern port city, much like New Orleans. So a lot of similarities there. They started around the same time as New Orleans, not around the same time, but around the same time as some of the other mafia families. You started seeing the emergence of guys in the black hand that are talking to people in Pittsburgh and Kansas City in the early 19 teens. The first inkling we get of the importance of the Tampa Mafia is in 1928 at the Hotel Statler meeting, where all these bootleggers from around the country are busted. And there's Ignacio Italiano from Tampa who's there to meet his friend Joe Profaci. So a little bit of a background there is that, the Mafia, the Sicilian group in Tampa started in Ybor City, and really a unique ethnic enclave with Cubans, Spanish immigrants, small German and Jewish population as well. And the Trafficante came over there. Santo Trafficante Sr. came there in the early 1900s from Sicily and settled in Tampa. So a lot of the immigrants from Sicily came from Alessandria della Rocca and Santo Stefano. So, a couple of the same villages. And there were some that came over that were mobsters in the old country as well. So that's kind of how things started. So Santo Trafficante Sr. really was the boss before his son took over, and probably around 1950-ish when that transfer of power began.
But the father, interesting enough, is whenever you talk about any business, or I hate to say this, even in the mob, generally any second generation anything, whether it be the mob or business, whatever it is, generally doesn't do as well. But candidly, the son totally usurped the power of the father. If you could just kind of give a little bit of color to that.
Oh, yeah. So Santos Sr. took over, and around 1940, the previous boss, Ignacio Antinori, was shot and killed outside Ybor City neighborhood on the outskirts of Tampa. And he kind of pushed out the reigning other power was a guy named Charlie Wall. So really, by the time Santos Sr. started gaining power and kind of solidifying his hold in the 40s, he was getting older. He got sick. And like I said, around 1950, Santo Jr. moves into the picture. A couple key things there, I think, kind of set him apart. He solidifies ties with mobsters in New York City. He's invited to Joe Profaci's daughter's wedding, or son's wedding, daughter's wedding, I think. He's at Appalachian. So all of a sudden he's thrust into a bigger spotlight because of his power base. That's not to say when he took over, there was actually a little bit of a resurgence of violence in Tampa. There was another faction that was kind of jostling for power, but he took the mantle. And the other thing I think was a big part of that was the interests in Cuba. I mean, they were making a lot of money in Cuba with the casinos, and Trafficante Jr. and Sr. to some extent before he passed, but Jr. really was the guy there.
Now, so he hooks up with New York, right? He builds up a local power base, but he also became immensely wealthy. What was the source of his initial wealth?
So illegal gambling was always really probably one of the biggest moneymakers for organized crime in Tampa. You had bootlegging. You did have narcotics. The Tampa Mafia were always involved tangentially in the narcotics trade. But really, illegal gambling, a game called Bolita, was big money. Yeah, and not just in Tampa, throughout Florida. And even in Miami, which, of course, most mob aficionados know was an open city.
Yeah.
Trafficante, he lived there for a while in the 60s, and he had a lot of, even though he didn't control it, when guys would come down, they would go see him, and he
Yeah.
had elite operations there. So yeah, legal gambling, and definitely I think Cuba, had Cuba continued, he would have definitely been among the wealthiest.
Interesting.
You know,
But what fascinates me about Santo Trafficante Jr. is, and you could argue, especially in the 60s, there were some crews in New York that were 35 deep. But I understand the Tampa Mafia was in the 30s, like not a huge number of made men. Did it peak and get down to 30, or was 35 always a working number?
I think around 30, between 35 and maybe 50, but that's as big as it got. And you're right. Now they had a strong affiliate associate base, but it was Trafficani, like Carlos Marcello, their power was not really proportional to the size of their families. I think they had
Yes.
kind of outsized influence
Yes.
compared to the size of their families.
Interesting. All right. So he builds up. He's a wealthy guy. He was also kind of a bit of a trailblazer. So he saw Cuba before Cuba was Cuba, So give us how, like, obviously you spoke Spanish, he had some advantage geographically, but it's not easy to sit at that table. So like, is that was he already powerful and then leveraged Cuba to become more powerful, or was Cuba like made him? You get what I'm saying? Like what was it like?
Yeah, yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
So the Tampa mob actually had interests in Cuba dating back to the Prohibition era. And there's a great story that President Machado, when he left Cuba in the late 30s, stayed at the house of Ignacio Antonori in Tampa. So the Tampa mob had kind of started having those relationships. I mean, Cuba was their was their source of bootleg liquor and rum and narcotics in the 1920s. Human smuggling also via Havana and through Tampa in the 1920s.
Wow.
But really, what kind of kicked things into high gear for Santo Jr. and what able to give him kind of that bigger push was the post World War II tourism boom. And then you have a friendly government in Cuba now under Fulgencio Batista. You have Meyer Lansky down there. Yeah. And like Trafficante, growing up in Ybor, spoke Spanish, understood Cuban culture. He was a natural fit, and he had a lot of very close connections down there. And not only with legitimate politicians and stuff, he also ingrained himself with underworld figures in Cuba. So
interesting. So when your research and the books that you've written and just your overall knowledge as an expert, what are some of the leadership business kind of learnings from a Santo Trafficante that you pull away? I always say the Dons of that era wasn't as simple as just a culture, but it was also like him, for example, spoke multiple languages, knew depth in culture, might have 35 guys, but had the power of having 3,000. What are some of the principles that you can kind of pull out from who Santo Trafficante was, and how are they applicable towards maybe business or everyday life?
I think he kept his cool. You don't really hear many stories of him kind of, losing his temper, losing his cool. And look, we've heard plenty of stories of wise guys that just go crazy and have those, for lack of a better term, sociopathic tendencies almost, with just, can't keep it cool. He was able to keep it cool. He had the loyalty of his crew and his family. There were guys that were made in Tampa for decades that were loyal to Trafficante. There was never a need for that. And I think from what I've heard, he was hands off when he needed to be, kind of delegated when he needed to be. He didn't micromanage. That's definitely a good from a manager perspective, as I am in my career. Micromanaging is something I wouldn't want done. And as a mob boss, it really also puts you in the line of fire when it comes to law enforcement and such. And I think one other quick thing too, and I think he saw trends where they were there, like you said, with Cuba.
Yeah.
But like a lot of managers, and this happens in business, sometimes you get a little bit of tunnel vision. The case in point there is when he gets kicked out of Cuba, throughout the 60s, he's focused on either getting back into Cuba or getting more casinos down in that part of the world. And kind of misses out on Vegas. So, so that was kind of always interesting to me that he was one of the few mafia families that didn't really get heavily involved in Vegas.
So that's interesting because I was going to ask. People hate when I use this word, but pivot. How did he result or pivot when obviously lost considerable wealth and lost the
Mhm.
opportunity in in Cuba? What did he do next?
So what back? So when he came over back to the United States after being released out of prison in Cuba, he moved to Miami primarily throughout the '60s, and there you see him involved in bolita operations. He had kind of a Cuban mafia working for him
Yeah.
then. Guys that came over, Cuban gangsters that came over after Castro took over.
Oh wow.
So illegal gambling, you start seeing a lot more mentions of him in relation to narcotics operations and from the financing. There were his trips to Saigon in 1968, where he supposedly met with French and Corsican drug traffickers.
Yeah.
So those were a couple of the areas. And, in through the 1970s, you kind of start seeing a little bit more of a hands-off approach as he's getting a little bit older. But
Yeah.
really, I would say if you look really at just the rackets, illegal gambling was still a big money maker for him. And
Interesting.
he wielded a lot of political power too, so
Yeah.
that helped with the legitimate investments as well.
Now, any big mistakes? So before I get to mistakes, but with Cuba, I never understood this, and we think we might have talked a little bit last time. Was Batista played ball, right? We know
Mhm.
that he was financed by them. Did Castro kind of give an olive branch, help me out, and I got you when I get in, or was Castro always? They knew he was going to be trouble all along.
No, Trafficante had known Castro. Castro had done fundraising in Tampa, many years prior, and
Yeah.
there's stories I've heard, albeit anecdotal, but people
Yeah.
that swear, he met with Trafficante when he was in Tampa. There wasn't, and I think there's a lot of information that the mob were funneling money and equipment to Castro as well, playing
Interesting.
both sides, thinking
Yeah.
that if this guy gets in, I don't think they foresaw that. Another interesting thing, a lot of people think when Castro took over, he closed the casinos and that was it.
Yeah.
He did close them for about a month, but then
Yeah.
a lot of the Cubans that worked in the casinos wanted them reopened. So he did
Yeah.
reopen the casinos.
Interesting.
There just was no tourism trade. So,
Okay.
yeah, so that kind of killed that. So yeah, I think Cuba was a misstep. He overstayed his welcome in Cuba, so he got imprisoned there.
Yeah.
So I think that was probably, if you look overall, that was probably one of his bigger missteps.
So what was the reason, as far as your research shows? I always thought it was, again, tangentially involved, maybe the second wave of Vegas, or had some resources in Vegas, but then I hear the opposite, not in some of my cursory research. So why do you think he missed out in Vegas, and did he get in at all, or what does your research show?
Yeah, I didn't see any concrete evidence that they were involved in Vegas other than running junkets and things out to there.
Yeah.
Um, some of it could have been geographic. It takes a long time, especially back then, to get from Tampa to Vegas.
Yeah.
He wasn't as close to Chicago or Kansas City or St.
Good point.
Louis or some of those families. And there were opportunities there. I talked to some guys that remember getting sent to like Ecuador and the Bahamas on behalf of Trafficante, and Meyer Lansky too. He was looking for operations in the Caribbean for casinos. So
Yeah. So, okay. So the other thing is, and I wanted to chat a little bit about, is although the Tampa mob, not big numbers, very strong, had a very low incidence of informants.
yeah.
And I would love to know, like, historically, like, not
Mhm.
from like the beginning. Why do you think that is?
Well, Tampa, up until even into the 1960s, was a very small town. Everyone knew each other. It
Yeah.
was very difficult to bring in an operative outside the family or outside Tampa into that. I mean, there were some informants, but real low level. And if you look at some of the FBI documents from the 60s, not really a lot of actionable intel,
Yeah.
oh, I saw this guy, or this guy knows this guy, kind of thing.
Yeah.
I talked to some FBI agents. I talked to some Florida Department of Law Enforcement agents who had informants, who sent people in. It just wasn't productive. They were very tight-lipped. They were very careful who they dealt with. They were very, especially guys like Trafficante, that older generation in general. But you didn't really see that level of interest by the mob to use law enforcement. Another thing was that the Tampa FBI too really wasn't as well equipped to deal with organized crime. They had some great agents who definitely worked it and gathered a lot of information. Um, but the real focus was even, Marcello was even a bigger focus for the Justice Department at that time than Trafficante.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you look, there was never a turncoat until John Mamone in the 2000, and his information was strictly related to one crew in Miami. So yeah, there's a paucity of turncoat. There's no Sammy Gravano of Tampa. So
Yeah. Now, Benny Binion, as I understand, had a relationship with the guys from the South, including Santo Trafficante. Can you speak to that?
So yeah, I've seen some tangential links. So there are some links between guys that operated out of Dallas, like James Dolan, R.D. Matthews especially. So R.D. Matthews, who was Binion's right-hand man, worked for Trafficante in Cuba in the casinos. Lauren Hall was another one, a Dallas-based guy that worked in the casinos in Cuba, knew Trafficante. So Trafficante knew some of the Dallas figures. He knew Savella. And then through Trafficante's ties with Carlos Marcello, and Marcello knew all those guys. So yeah, I think they all hung around together. And even though Binion wasn't really active in Cuba, I think Trafficante knew him through a lot of those familiar and associations. Those guys.
Interesting.
And one other thing, real quick, too, on that is Joe Campisi, who was supposedly had taken over after Savella died. There were ties with him, with Marcello, but also with Trafficante back in the day.
Interesting. So, again, I always look at formidable business leaders, Cosa Nostra leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because one of the things on the Cosa Nostra side is I see a weakness when it comes to exit strategy and succession strategy,
Mm-hmm.
right? From Gambino to Castellano, kind of didn't go so great. Some of the bigger families that New Orleans, and you could go on where once that kind of great leader died, had a steep decline. Who took over after Trafficante, and what was his succession plan, and who took over after he passed?
So the person at all law enforcement pointed to as the successor of Trafficante was Vincent Lascalzo. And
Yes,
he was
right.
supposedly the guy that took over. And he's still around. He's still in Tampa.
Yeah.
Never been convicted of a serious crime. Retired for all intents and purposes.
Yeah.
There's nothing for him to be a boss of anymore.
Yeah.
But there wasn't a really great succession plan. And the thing about Tampa is they faded away, not necessarily because of law enforcement.
Yeah.
They kind of just faded away. And a lot of that was attrition. And a lot of that might have been the exit strategy is, hey, let's start, because you start seeing, especially in the 90s, these guys are going into bank fraud and then, legitimate business. And the sons are not going into organized crime. They're buying up property and they're going into legitimate business. In fact, there's a couple guys that are still around that are considered made guys.
Yeah.
That are just very successful, legitimate businessmen. So, that could have been a long-term exit strategy. The other side of it is, he had an underboss, Frank Deitche. In fact, there's a wiretap in the 70s where Frank Deitche is overheard saying he can't wait for Trafficante to die so he could become boss. But he became kind of part of a ruling panel. And the other interesting thing is Trafficante had a couple brothers that, survived him, including Henry Trafficante, who was a longtime mob figure. And there was supposedly a lot of bad blood between the brothers. So it wasn't even that he didn't even consider his immediate family as part of his succession plan.
Interesting. So, okay. So the next question is, you talked about the attrition and, hold on one second. Can you, sorry about that. I don't know how to do the pause button on the other thing. It's too loud. Now I gotta edit this. I always go live. 400 interviews live to tape. The one that has to get edited, it is what it is. Okay. So
that's fine.
Okay. So really quick, just give us. That's why I pre-recorded this one. All right. So back. Okay. So you bring up an interesting point, and here's kind of an important question. In New York, New Jersey, maybe even Chicago, obviously Sicily, etc. Cosa Nostra is a way of life. It was, part of who you were. It was your being. that kind of stuff, right? Now, Tampa, it looked like Cosa Nostra was used as a way to move up to upper society and then like kind of shed it, if you will. So, like, why is it that, in New York it still exists and it's a way of life, versus Tampa, it was kind of meant to maybe still be a brotherhood, maybe still to be, some enterprise, but go more legitimate, more about money, and then kind of shed the illegal aspect, versus
Mhm.
New York, it's kind of the opposite. It's more of a way of life. Why do you think?
Yeah, I think part of it was that the Tampa community, the guys all knew each other. They grew up together. It was very close knit. So, I think they felt like that wasn't, really what they wanted to do in the sense like New York, where you constantly have young guys coming up into that.
Yeah.
Even now, here we are in 2022. There's probably some young kid out there
Yeah.
who's going to end up being a banana associate or something.
Yeah.
Um, with Tampa, you started even seeing in the 70s, a lot of the younger guys were just getting into like marijuana smuggling or drugs. They weren't really being brought up into like the Bolita rackets and stuff. And then once the Florida lottery comes, so that once the Florida lottery comes, that kills Bolita. So that's a big, source of illegal revenue out of the way. And you still have sports bookmaking. Um, but yeah, I that's a good question. I've never really sat down and I've talked to guys. I've talked to guys that used to be bookmakers or used to be Bolita sellers, and they're just went legitimate. And they said it just kind of, especially once Trafficante died, things just kind of like drifted away, if you will. And you look at that from a business perspective. If there's like a successful family restaurant that's been in a family for 70 years and the patriarch dies and just kind of goes away or falls apart or
Well, that's the
so
thing. Go ahead. Sorry.
oh no, that just ended on that.
Well, that was the thing. Like, again, I'm fascinated because, I always kind of look at it like, does a good mob boss want their children to be in it? And I remember when they made Gotti's son, Chin went to him. Sorry to hear it. Yeah, he made, I think, like two of his sons. But so I just find it interesting, the way of life versus maybe having, kind of an exit strategy. What's kind of the spirit now? Is there a few guys knocking around? Is there maybe an old neighborhood, an old social club? What's kind of the word on the street?
Yeah, and one other thing I did want to bring up that you just reminded me of when you said
Please.
that too is one of the bigger cases. It kind of fell apart in the early '90s. Was this case called the Key Bank case, and all these guys, drug dealers and mobsters, were using this bank basically to launder money. But it kind of brought into a focus a little bit of one of the key things that they still kept was these old neighborhood connections. So, oh yeah, I know that guy. I grew up with him. Or I saw you shaking hands with him. Yeah, because I grew up with him. That's kind of unique to Tampa in a way that the power structure in Tampa, the people that grow up in Tampa, even now is the Tampa Bay area is like 2.5 million people. It's just blowing up like crazy.
Yeah.
But the core of Tampa, the I'm going to call it like the power elite or the good old boy network or whatever. There's a lot of fourth generation Tampanians, Tampanos, fourth or fifth generation that grew up together. And you see that a lot of those old wise guys use those family connections back in like the late 80s, early 90s when they start moving into more white collar. Then it's more a matter of, well, I have this property. How about a favorable zoning ruling for me? Or let me kind of leverage these relationships.
Correct.
So it becomes kind of like a business networking thing more than a criminal enterprise, is utilizing more of the political, the connection network aspect of it rather than, using it for a drug dealing operation or something.
Now, because of that, in terms of outcomes, very few mobsters may have died in prison that were made from Tampa, correct? Because I understand. I was trying to do some research, and I couldn't find a bolus of like 20 guys that went away for life or died in jail. I think it's very few, correct?
Zero.
Wow.
Zero. Yeah. No Tampa. Well, there were two associates that died in prison in the 70s. One was actually put to death for a murder of a cop, but there were no made. They weren't made guys. They were low level associates. And to your other question before too, there's I think last count I had like 8 or 9 guys that are considered made guys by law enforcement. They're all in their 80s now. They're definitely up there in the years. So, but they're still around.
Interesting.
Just hanging out at the cigar bars.
Yeah, exactly. Now, why did Well, Trafficante again, it's alleged because he went out to Southeast Asia, was probably part
Mhm.
of possible heroin network, but kind of the 70s, obviously eventually the 80s, the cocaine explosion came on the scene. Did they consciously say, hey, you know what, we're gonna stay out of that, or where is the intersection of the Tampa mob and their tentacles in Miami and the cocaine boom of the 80s?
Yeah, that's a good question because the mob really overall, I don't wanna say missed the boat, that's
Yeah,
but they just
kind
weren't.
of did though.
Yeah, but they weren't part of that network.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
the
yeah.
thing. I think they were on the outside looking at it with heroin. They
Yeah,
had, 50 years of these connections through
yeah,
whether it was the French connection or
yeah,
Southeast Asia, the
yeah,
Corsicans. They had this network already there. Then all of a sudden, this brand new network shows up with both Cuban and Colombians. They don't need the mob. They don't really need them. So, the mob guys become the customers. They become now almost the street level guys. They're
yeah,
not the wholesalers anymore. They're buying from
yeah,
the Colombians and the Cubans and especially in Miami and demographics plays a lot. You see you look in the 1960s, there's this great thing called the mayor's list of hoodlums. You can find it online, I think, but
yeah,
dozens of wise guys that live in Miami-Dade County. Fast forward to the mid 80s, the Sun Sentinel comes out with a list of there's like 300 or 400 mob guys and associates in South Florida, but they're all in Broward County and moving up. So they all kind of leave Miami area. So Miami still is that epicenter of drug smuggling, and there's still some mob guys down there, but things change, and they just got left out of the whole cocaine cowboy picture.
Interesting. Now, you and I can agree. We don't, agree with drug use. We don't agree with drug distribution. I personally have a moral aversion to drugs. I assume you do too. I have a brother, lost brother to drugs. But looking outside in from a business perspective, did the mafia miss the boat by not doing, like maybe earlier on, influencing their 26 city influence, saying, hey, we could do your distro for Coke. We already have a heroin pipeline. Or do you think maybe in the long run, it might have been the right move because it might have been past the pale of government tolerance? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it was probably the right move. I, you look at a lot of those major cases, especially early on, like with the Gambinos. Like who was it? Angelo Ruggiero gets busted for heroin. He, it was a Gene Gotti too that
Yeah.
gets sentenced to like 40 years. So yeah, they would have been in the same boat as a lot of these other, and they would have been at a disadvantage because the other things about the Colombian and Cuban
Yeah.
traffickers, they can go back. They can go
Yeah.
back to Colombia. They can go back to
Correct.
Cuba. Where's the American wise guy? He's not going to go back to Sicily.
Correct.
Um,
Correct.
so no, I don't. I think yeah, at that time you can say, wow, man, we're missing a great money making opportunity. But looking back in retrospect, probably not.
Love it. Now,
Oh,
just give you guys some background. I'm gonna actually put a link to his author page
mhm.
because he has a great book, Cigar City Mafia. Also, what gangland is New Jersey,
Yep.
and if you're an expert in a few different areas,
Mhm.
but guys like us, we go down a rabbit hole. We always want to stay fresh. What are some of the newer things you're working on, and what rabbit hole are you kind of diving in now?
So I just in May of 2022, my book Hitman about the East Harlem Purple Gang will be coming out.
Ah,
It's a
that'll be
first kind
good.
of overview, just an overview of that
Yeah,
group, and never been written about before.
yeah.
And then my next deep dive, I have a couple ideas. One of which that I've been kicking around for a while, and through a couple recent serendipitous timing things, maybe potentially a book on Jerry Katina, who is I think
Oh,
probably.
like I always said, I wouldn't give him like Tony Batter status. I might be pushing it, but I want to put him up there as maybe top 5 guys you never heard of.
Oh, absolutely. And he was so powerful in New Jersey.
Yep.
And again, you want to talk about when that book comes out, I'll come back. We could talk about his
Yeah.
business acumen of,
Yeah.
talk about someone who really from the beginning invested a ton of money to various legitimate business, everything from Bally Gaming to
Yep.
all kinds of stuff.
Yep. And then it's interesting because I always say, the Genevieve's power is most powerful then, most powerful
Mhm.
now. And, us being Jersey guys, I hate to say this, but guys like Jerry Katina, guys like Bobby Manna, Richie the Boot, like there's a whole
Oh yeah.
bunch of core guys that were Wales and the Genovese family that were Jersey centric. And what I find interesting about it is it gets overlooked, you know?
Oh, absolutely. Well, look, when my book Garden State Gangland came out,
Yeah.
quick plug.
Yeah.
That came out 3 years ago. That was
Yeah.
the first ever overall history of the mob in Jersey.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm like, how come nobody ever did this? You know, there's 1,000,001 books on New York mob history, but there wasn't really one overarching one on New Jersey. And there's 100 great stories out of that Jersey. But
that's awesome. So I'm going to put links below. Scott is going to, I'm sure he's going to be on soon. He's going to be hopefully a recurring guest. He's a great gentleman. I'm considering
anytime.
him a friend. And again, I'm going to put a link below, but for those maybe on the audio version, how can people find you, Scott?
You can find me at scottdeitche.com, tampamafia.com. If you're in the Tampa area, we do a Tampa Mafia walking tour of Ybor City. That's become really super popular. And then I'm on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all the social medias. So
love it. And when's the pub date for the new book?
Right now, the latest I saw is May 2022. I think like May 15th, 2022, the new book will be coming out. In fact, I just got the proofs earlier today, so I'm going to go look through them.
I'm excited, and I'll be the first in line. So, Scott, thank you very much for being on the Armchair MBA.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Tom. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.